This is the first sign that you have that we didn't solve the problem. But it goes on from there. For this budget package to fully be approved, there are 5 pieces that have to go on a May 19th ballot. There's a spending cap, which Republicans forced into the negotiations as a way of limiting the growth of government. Again, they're trying to get at this, how do we limit the cost of government? There's the lottery capitalization plan, which requires a constitutional amendment to do. Proposition 63 put a surtax on millionaires. If you made over $1 million, you had to pay a 1% tax into this fund that paid for mental health. Well, this budget borrows from that fund, so you have to go to the voters for that. And the Prop 10. This was the 50 cent a pack cigarette tax. You know, all those local county funds that have the Prop 10 groups. They're borrowing money from them, and they have to go to the voters to do that. There's a debate over whether they'll have to go to the voters on Prop 98, because Prop 98 had some provisions that they're setting aside for this initiative as well. The one last push was successful. At 5:30 this morning, Senator Abel Maldonado joined 2 of his colleagues in the Senate. They needed 3 votes in the Senate to pass this. They needed 3 Republican votes. He was able to get his concessions, which we'll look at in a second, his 4 demands. He was able to get those through. The other person they were talking about was David Cox from Roseville. He wanted to repeal the entire greenhouse initiative that Governor Schwarzenegger had pushed through. Democrats wouldn't even think of it. So while he was sort of one of the leading candidates, he got repealed quickly. So what were his 4 demands? Well, the first was he wanted a constitutional amendment that every day past September 30th, when the budget's supposed to be passed, lawmakers would not be paid. So right now, they don't get their paycheck, but once it passes, they get the paycheck for the whole time. His proposal was, no, we should take your money away. Some members felt that that was sort of elitist because he comes from a wealthy background and they couldn't afford to not get paid. So that proposal actually died on the floor of the Senate. However, they did approve a ballot initiative that will go on the June, it says join the ballot, it's actually in June 2010, that will say in deficit years lawmakers don't get raises. And it also says, and this was the highly controversial one, that we're going to put on the ballot an open primary system. Now in an open primary system, what it means is instead of having a Republican candidate, we're having a series of Republicans who run against each other and a group of Democrats who run against each other for the privilege of facing each other in the November election, you would simply put all the names on one ballot, everybody would vote, and the top 2 vote getters would run off in November. Now what that would mean is that in heavily Democratic districts, what you would have are 2 Democrats likely on the ballot. If you go to San Francisco, where it's like 20% Republican, and the Republicans there would vote Democrat if they could, you have a situation where you would have no Republicans on the November ballot. It's likely, though, you would have a liberal and a moderate Democrat or Republican. And the same thing would be true in the Central Valley and the Republican districts. And so that would create more opportunity to have more balanced, more open to conversation, more centrist lawmakers, like Abel Maldonado, in the legislature, which would then make this process more of a focus on common interests and less on sort of these polar partisan divides that have led us where we are today. His 4th concession, and he added this at the last minute, this was actually one of David Cox's ideas, was to get rid of one of the taxes, and he didn't care which one. And so he cut a deal where the gas tax was eliminated, but the income surtax was added, and they also did a couple line items on spending items in the budget to the tune of about $600 million. So that happened this morning. They passed the runoff at 5 o'clock and the budget like a half hour after that. So what should be done? I've got about 5 minutes left. First, let me just say, if this budget hadn't passed, it probably wasn't the end of the world for California. It would have been a difficult road, but it would not have been the end of the world. Even now, our cash flow is going to be tight for the next 2 months. We may have to go to financial markets and get those payday loans just to get us through, because our February and March tend to be, in February we owe a huge paycheck to school districts. Last year we paid about $12 billion in February when we only had revenues of about $5.5 billion. So there's just these hiccups in the budget cycle where you need the extra cash. So cash flow is still going to be tough. The good news for the construction industry, those projects that Schwarzenegger was going to suspend this morning if no budget was passed, and this was obviously a negotiating position for the governor, those can now continue. Folks can show up and go to work today. We actually may be able to borrow the $6 billion if we need it at this point. If you think about it, if you go to the bank and say, can I have some money? And they say, well, what's your budget look like? And you can't tell them what your budget is, they're not going to loan you money, right? Well, the same thing is sort of true for the state. If I can't tell you what my plan is for spending and revenues, then it's going to be very hard to go to financial markets and get any kind of favorable offerings on paper. So California will be able to borrow funds if we need to. The funding cuts that many districts are looking at, they're going to have to continue to plan for. I mean, the state just passed next year's budget, which means every school district between now and the end of this fiscal year and every local government is going to have to pass their budgets based on that document. Now, as the stimulus money becomes available, we will see modifications to this, so it probably won't be worse. It probably won't be as bad as the current budget makes them look. For example, SEMA Unified is going to lay off 17% of their teachers. That's their current plan. I will point out one thing. These are January budget numbers, right? This is the governor's budget. He released it the first week in January. All the news we've gotten since the first week in January is bad in terms of the economy. Aside from the sale of chocolate being up, the news is bad in every sector. So one of the HP today announced their sales are way down, or their expectation of sales. This budget may be good for about 3 months. In May, the government produces a revised expectation of revenues based on the tax collections. Quarterly payments are due in March and income tax payments are due in April. So they'll have a better sense of what our revenue stream is expected to be. It could get worse. We could be looking at another $10 to $20 billion for all we know. There's really tremendous uncertainty out there. We don't know what it's going to be. If it is, then this whole conversation starts again and goes through the fall. Why can it happen? The big problem in California is voters don't trust their lawmakers. You go back to the origins of the state, we've never trusted them. In the old days, it was the evil railroads. Today, it's probably public employee unions followed by evil companies. In fact, interestingly enough, in this budget, in recognition of the economic hard times we face, the legislature created some significant reforms that should help business in California. They gave them a tax credit for creating new jobs, for example. So, I mean, business did okay in this budget relative to individuals. The redistricting that drew the partisan districts has led to this problem. The good news is that we're going to do it again in 3 years now. Seems like it was a long way off when we actually started this conversation. The other thing to remember is California's economy, if it does turn around, and most of the experts, I think, are talking the last quarter of this year, the first quarter of 2010 as the earliest. When it turns around, California's economy is fully capable of taking off and solving any kind of fiscal problems. It turns out if you have extra cash to play with, we don't argue over how to spend it. We just spend it. There's also, inside of the system, though, some confusion. It's just a very convoluted governance system. School finance, for example. Who's responsible for school district budgets? Well, your local school board will tell you that Sacramento was evil and didn't give us enough money this year. Sacramento will tell you that the local school boards didn't use the money wisely. It turns out in both cases, the folks who are really driving a lot of the conversation are the public employee unions. At the state level, the California Teachers Association has lots of money and they use it aggressively. They have lots of influence in the legislature. At the local district level, most of the school board members' campaigns are funded. The winning campaigns are funded by the local educators associations. So, you know, as you look at the process and you say, where did the money go? I mean, part of the reason why I use the teacher salary example is because, in fact, those are the places where the money's ending up. And in government, you know, 80% of the cost of government is services, and that means buying people. And so if your people are really well organized, and I don't fault the unions for this, the problem is the governance system that allows the choices to be made without any sort of discussion of trade-offs. For example, should we have increased teacher salaries slightly less and at the same time spent that money for health care for young children or for creating a tax incentive so that we can have a little bit more business activity? We don't have those conversations. It's all done on the side in an incremental basis. What do we have to do to change it? Well, first recognize this proposal only works if the stuff that goes on the ballot gets approved. I guarantee you Republicans will not negotiate next time around over a spending cap if the spending cap falls in the election. I guarantee you that the lottery fiscalization money will not happen if it's not passed because the state won't have authority to do it. There are a lot of things on this ballot that voters still have to go along with. The other thing that could solve all these problems is the state economy could just grow forever and we couldn't have any hiccups. We have had periods where that's been the case. Entire administrations, Duke Majan's administration, which was a pretty smooth administration. He started off a little rocky. The other things, though, that can really make a difference is if we can bring accountability and openness in the budget process. And I only have a half hour and I'm almost out of time, which is good because I'm almost done.